The Council of United Systems did not believe in ghosts. They believed in math, energy, readings, and the cold reality of steel. But as the dark shape appeared on their long-range scanners, the word ghost was the only thing the technicians could whisper. It was huge. It was silent. It was a metal mountain drifting through the void of the neutral zone. The scanners could not identify the material. It was not the sleek chrome of the Alari ships or the jagged rock armor of the Korg. It was something older, something harder. It was a floating fortress made by a race that everyone thought was still living in caves on a tiny blue planet. Commander Valen of the Alari Navy looked at the screen. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "Is that a human ship?" he asked. His voice was full of doubt. Humans were known for being messy. They were known for loud music and strange food. They were not known for building things that could dwarf a moon. "It is not just a ship, Commander," his assistant replied, her hands shaking as she pulled up the thermal data. "It is a city with guns the size of our cruisers." The fortress was called the Aegis of Sol. For decades, humanity had stayed quiet. They had been pushed around by the larger empires, forced to take the worst mining colonies and the most dangerous trade routes. The galaxy thought humans were weak because humans were polite. The galaxy thought humans were slow because humans liked to talk before they fought. They were wrong. While the empires fought small wars over tiny moons, humanity had been building. They had been pouring every ounce of their spite and their hope into one single project. They didn't want a fleet. They wanted a statement. As the Aegis moved closer to the border of the Korg Empire, the silence of the ship was its most terrifying feature. It did not send out radio signals. It did not ask for permission to pass. It simply existed, 1 trillion tons of dark metal moving through the stars. On the bridge of the Aegis, Captain Marcus Thorne sat in a simple chair. He didn't have a throne like the Korg warlords. He didn't have a crystal command pod like the Alari. He had a screen and a cup of coffee. He looked at the map of the stars and saw the Korg blockade ahead. They were blocking the path to a human colony that was starving. The Korg thought they could starve the humans into giving up their land. Thorne took a sip of his coffee. "They haven't moved," he said quietly. His crew worked around him with a calm focus. These were people who had grown up in the shadows of the great empires. They were tired of being small. "Do they think we are a supply ship?" a young officer asked. Thorne smiled, but there was no light in his eyes. "They think we are a target. They are about to find out that when you push a human, they don't just push back. They build something so big that you can't push it at all." The Korg fleet began to power up their weapons. Red lights flickered across the void as their plasma cannons charged. The Korg admiral sent a message that echoed through the Aegis. "Turn back, little monkeys, or we will burn your metal toy to ash." Thorne didn't record a long speech. He didn't argue. He just nodded to his weapons officer. "Open the front." "Shutters," he said. The front of the Aegis didn't just open. It unfolded like a giant, hungry mouth. Inside was a barrel so wide that a whole squadron of ships could fly through it. It was the main gun, a weapon that used the gravity of a small sun to fire a slug of pure iron. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson. Humans were not the strongest, and they were not the fastest. But humans were the ones who would build a nightmare just to make sure they were never bothered again. The Aegis of Sol was not just a fortress. It was the end of the old way of doing things. As the first shot fired, the light was so bright it blinded the Korg sensors. The nightmare had arrived, and it was made by the people everyone had ignored. The blast from the Aegis of Sol did not sound like a normal gun. In the vacuum of space, there should have been silence. But the sheer power of the weapon created a vibration that could be felt in the bones of every living thing for light years. The Korg admiral, a hulking beast with thick scales and yellow eyes, watched his lead cruiser disappear. It didn't explode in a ball of fire. It simply ceased to exist. The iron slug fired by the human fortress had hit the ship at a fraction of the speed of light, turning the Korg vessel into a cloud of glowing dust. The admiral stood frozen on his bridge. His people had spent 1,000 years perfecting plasma shields, but you cannot shield against a mountain of metal moving that fast. On the Aegis, Captain Marcus Thorne did not celebrate. He watched the tactical screen as the Korg fleet scrambled. They were like angry bees whose hive had been hit by a rock. "Target the secondary cruisers," Thorne said calmly. "They are trying to flank us. They think we are too big to turn." It was a logical thought. In space combat, the smaller, faster ship usually had the advantage over a large, slow target. But the Aegis was not a normal ship. It was built with human ingenuity and a complete lack of respect for the laws of traditional ship design. Instead of turning the whole ship, the Aegis used a system of internal gravity wheels. The entire outer shell of the fortress rotated, bringing a new set of weapon batteries to face the enemy in seconds. The Korg ships fired back. Thousands of red plasma bolts rained down on the Aegis. The crew inside felt the hum of the kinetic barriers. Unlike the energy shields used by other races, the humans used sand shields, clouds of ionized dust held in a magnetic field. When the plasma hit the dust, the energy was absorbed and scattered. To the Korg, it looked like their weapons were simply disappearing into a gray fog. "Their weapons are useless," the young officer, Sarah, shouted. She was a technician who had helped build the engine core. "They are hitting us with everything they have, and the hull temperature hasn't even gone up by 1 degree. As the battle continued, the sheer size of the Aegis became its greatest weapon. It wasn't just firing guns, it was pulling the enemy ships toward it. The gravity generated by the massive station was so strong that the smaller Korg fighters found themselves struggling to fly away. It was like trying to swim away from a whirlpool. The fortress was literally a man-made planet, and it was claiming the Korg fleet as its new moons. Thorne watched as several Korg ships collided with each other, unable to fight the gravitational pull. "This is not a fight," Thorne whispered. "This is an intervention." The Korg admiral finally realized his mistake. He sent a frantic signal to the rest of the Korg galaxy. "Help us. The humans have built a monster. It is not a ship, it is a death machine." But the Alari and the other empires did not move. They watched from their long-range sensors, paralyzed by what they saw. They had spent years laughing at humans for their love of old technology like internal combustion and solid projectiles. Now, they saw that a simple iron ball, when fired by a massive enough engine, was more terrifying than any laser. The humans had taken the most basic concepts of physics and turned them into a nightmare. Inside the fortress, the life was almost normal. While a war was happening outside, thousands of families lived in the inner rings. There were parks with real grass, schools, and hospitals. The Aegis was designed to be a permanent home for the human race, if Earth ever fell. This was why the crew fought so hard. They weren't just soldiers, they were protectors of their children. A young boy in the residential sector looked up through a reinforced window. He saw the flashes of light from the battle, but he wasn't afraid. He knew his father was at the controls. He knew the metal walls around him were thicker than any mountain on Earth. The Korg fleet began to retreat. They left behind the wreckage of their best ships. The blockade was broken. The path to the human colonies was clear. Thorne looked at the screen and saw the tiny colony ships waiting on the other side. They had been trapped for months, starving and hopeless. "Send the signal," Thorne ordered. "Tell them the way is open. Tell them the Aegis is here to stay." The message went out, not just to the colonies, but to every corner of the galaxy. It was a simple message, translated into every known language. Humanity is no longer asking for space. We are taking it. The Alari Council, watching from their distant crystal palace, finally spoke. "We must talk to these humans," their leader said, his voice trembling. "We must find out what they want before they bring that fortress to our borders." But the humans didn't want to talk anymore. They had spent a century talking. Now, they had the biggest gun in the galaxy, and they were very, very tired of being interrupted. The Aegis of Sol turned its massive nose toward the next sector, its engines glowing like a new star. The nightmare was just beginning for the empires of the galaxy, and for the first time in history, the humans were the ones smiling. Word of the Korg's defeat spread like a wildfire through the stars. In the high halls of the Alari, the great elders gathered. They were tall, elegant beings who had ruled the trade routes for 6,000 years. To them, humans were a loud, messy species that had only recently discovered how to leave their own solar system. Now, that same primitive species was steering a metal moon through the heart of the galaxy. The Alari did not like surprises, and the Aegis of Sol was the biggest surprise in history. They decided to send an envoy, not to fight, but to spy and to trick. They sent Ambassador Valis, the cleverest negotiator in the sector, to meet the human monster face to face. When Valis's small golden ship approached the Aegis, he felt a sense of dread. The scanners on his ship began to beep frantically. Warning, extreme gravitational mass. Detected, the computer screamed. Valis looked out the view screen. Up close, the fortress didn't look like a ship at all. It looked like a landscape. He saw massive valleys of machinery and mountains of armor plating. There were lights everywhere, thousands of tiny yellow dots that marked the windows of the people living inside. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a civilization. It was a fortress that didn't need a planet because it was a planet. The docking process was terrifyingly smooth. Huge magnetic arms reached out and grabbed the Alari ship with the gentleness of a mother holding a child. Valis stepped out into a docking bay that was so large he couldn't see the other side. There were no golden statues or crystal fountains here. It was all gray steel, yellow warning stripes, and the smell of hot oil and ozone. A group of human soldiers waited for him. They didn't wear flowing robes like the Alari. They wore thick, practical armor and carried rifles that looked heavy and dangerous. Their leader was a woman named Commander Sarah Vance. She didn't bow. She just nodded. "Follow me, Ambassador. The captain is busy, but he has time for a short chat." As they walked, Valis tried to use his species' natural ability to sense emotions. Usually, he could feel the fear or the greed of others. But from the humans, he felt something he had never felt before. A strange mix of exhaustion and absolute pride. They weren't happy to be at war, but they were deeply satisfied that they were finally winning. They passed a large window that looked into a school. Valis stopped, his 4 eyes wide. "You have children here?" he asked, his voice shaking. "In the middle of a war machine?" Vance looked at the kids, playing, and smiled. "It's only a war machine if you try to hurt us, Ambassador. To them, it's just home. We built this so they would never have to run from a Korg raid ever again." They reached the bridge, which was a hub of constant activity. Screens displayed data from across the quadrant. Captain Marcus Thorne was looking at a 3D map of the galaxy. He looked older than Valis expected. His hair was gray, and his hands were scarred. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life building something and was finally seeing it work. "Ambassador," Thorne said without looking up, "I know why you are here. You want to know if we are going to attack the Alari. You want to know if we are the new kings of the galaxy." Valis straightened his robes. "We only wish for peace, Captain, but your fortress is a threat to the balance of power. It is an illegal structure under the Galactic Accord." Thorne finally looked at him. His eyes were cold. "The Galactic Accord was written by people who wanted to keep humans small. It says we can only have 10 cruisers. Well, look around. Ambassador, this isn't a cruiser. This is a mobile habitat. It just happens to have very large guns. If the Alari want to talk about laws, they should start by explaining why they sat and watched while the Korg burned our outer colonies 5 years ago." The room went silent. Valis had no answer. It was true the Alari had ignored the human suffering because they didn't want to lose their trade deals with the Korg. Thorne stepped closer. "We aren't here to be kings, Valis. We are here to be the nightmare of anyone who thinks they can bully us. We spent 100 years being the polite species. We shared our art, our music, and our science. The galaxy took it all and gave us nothing but crumbs. So, we stopped talking. We started digging. Every mine on every human moon for the last 50 years has been sending its ore to one place, this place." Valis felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that the humans hadn't just built a ship, they had built a grudge. The Aegis of Sol was the physical form of every human insult, every stolen colony, and every ignored plea for help. "What do you want?" Valis whispered. Thorne turned back to the map. "I want the Korg to leave the Orion sector. I want the trade routes. open to everyone, not just your people. And I want the galaxy to understand one thing. The next time a human colony is attacked, we won't send a letter. We will send the Aegis. And we will park it right over your capital, until you remember how to say, sorry. The ambassador was escorted back to his ship. He had come to spy, but he left with a warning that would change the galaxy forever. As his ship pulled away, he looked back at the fortress. It was moving again, its massive engines pushing it toward the Korg homeworld. It was a slow, unstoppable force of nature. Valis realized that the age of the Ilari and the Korg was over. The humans hadn't just joined the game, they had broken the board. The galaxy's worst nightmare was finally awake, and it was hungry for justice. The Korg High Command was in a state of pure panic. Their home planet, Korg Prime, was a world of jagged mountains and deep industrial pits. They were a people who respected only strength. But the strength they were currently seeing on their long-range sensors was beyond their understanding. The Aegis of Sol was not jumping through hyperspace like a normal ship. Instead, it was folding space around itself, appearing and disappearing like a ghost that weighed 1 billion tons. Every time it reappeared, it was closer to the Korg. Heartland, the Korg warlord, a scarred veteran named Grak, pounded his fist on the war table. Summon the Iron Guard. Every ship, every station, every satellite. If this human mountain wants a fight, we will give them a sun's worth of fire. The Iron Guard was the pride of the Korg Empire. It consisted of 5,000 heavy destroyers, each one built for one purpose, to kill. They formed a wall of steel around Korg Prime. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the galaxy. Even the Ilari kept their distance, fearing that the collision between the Korg fleet and the human fortress would crack the very fabric of the sector. On the bridge of the Aegis, the atmosphere was different. There was no shouting, no pounding of fists. There was only the rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the steady hum of the massive core. Captain Thorne sat with his eyes closed, listening to the report from his scanners. "They've brought everything, Captain." "Sarah," Vance reported. "The entire Korg military is between us and their planet." Thorne opened his eyes. "They still think this is a battle of fleets," he said. "They think we are here to exchange shots with their destroyers. They don't understand that the Aegis is not a ship, it is a tectonic event." He looked at his chief engineer. "Is the anchor ready?" The engineer nodded. The anchor was a secret project that had taken 20 years to build. It was a device that could project a localized gravity field so intense it could mimic a black hole for a few seconds. It wasn't designed to destroy ships, it was designed to stop them from moving. All of them. At once, as the Aegis drifted into the middle of the Korg formation, the Iron Guard opened fire. Millions of plasma bolts, missiles, and railgun slugs hit the human fortress. The gray sand, shields glowed white under the pressure. The outer armor of the Aegis began to flake and melt in places, but the fortress did not stop. It kept moving forward, silent and grim. "They are hitting us hard, Captain," a young officer yelled. "Armor integrity at 80%. Thorne didn't flinch. "Hold the line. We need to be in the center of their web. Wait for my mark." The Korg warlord laughed as he watched the human ship take damage. "See? They are just flesh and bone like anyone else. Keep firing. Melt them into a slag heap." He ordered his ships to close in, to surround the Aegis so it had no way to turn or run. This was exactly what Thorne wanted. The 5,000 Korg ships moved in tight, their engines roaring. They were so close to the Aegis that they could see the individual rivets on its hull. They were ready for the kill. "Now," Thorne said. It was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The Aegis didn't fire its big gun. Instead, a series of rings around the center of the fortress began to spin. They spun so fast they became a blur of blue light. Suddenly, a wave of invisible force exploded outward. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but an explosion of weight. Every Korg ship was suddenly hit by a gravitational pull 1,000 times stronger than their engines could handle. Their hulls groaned, their wings snapped. The Korg sailors were pinned to their floors, unable to breathe. The entire Iron Guard fleet was frozen in place, stuck to the invisible anchor of the Aegis like flies on a spiderweb. Then, the Aegis began to move again. But it didn't just fly. It dragged the entire Korg fleet with it. 5,000 ships, the entire military might of an empire, were being towed behind. The human fortress. The Aegis was using the Korg's own ships as a shield. It moved toward the Korg orbital shipyards, dragging the broken remains of the Iron Guard like a trail of garbage. The Korg defenses on the planet couldn't fire back because their own ships were in the way. It was a total, humiliating defeat. The humans hadn't even used their main cannon. They had simply taken the Korg's strength and turned it into a heavy chain. Inside the residential sector of the Aegis, the people watched the screens in silence. They saw the mighty Korg fleet reduced to a pile of scrap metal being pulled through the void. There was no cheering. There was only a deep, somber realization. They had become the thing that everyone feared. They were the monsters now. But as they looked at the pictures of their own destroyed colonies on the other screens, the guilt faded. They were not the aggressors. They were the ones who were finally finishing a war that the Korg had started a long time ago. Thorn watched the Korg homeworld grow larger in the view screen. "Open a channel to the planet," he ordered. "Tell Warlord Grak that I am coming down for a visit, and tell him he should probably find a chair. He's going to have a very long day." The Aegis of Sol arrived at Korg Prime not as a conqueror, but as a silent judge. The massive fortress sat in the upper atmosphere, its shadow covering the entire capital city of the Korg Empire. Below, the Korg people looked up in terror. They had spent their lives believing they were the hunters of the galaxy. Now, they were the prey. The sky was filled with the twisted metal of their own Iron Guard fleet, still held in the Aegis's gravitational grip. It was a graveyard in the sky. Captain Marcus Thorne stood in the teleporter room. He wasn't wearing a suit of gold or a crown. He was wearing his standard blue uniform, the same one he wore when he was cleaning the engine rooms 10 years ago. He appeared in the center of the Korg High Council chamber. The room was full of smoke and the smell of fear. Warlord Grak sat at the head of the table, his hand resting on a heavy blade. Around him, the other generals growled, their scales standing up in a defensive posture. "You dare come here alone?" Grak spat. "I could have my guards kill you before you can blink." Thorne didn't look afraid. He walked to the window and looked out at the massive shadow of his ship. "You could," Thorne said quietly, "but if my heart rate stops, the Aegis is programmed to drop every ship it is currently holding. 5,000 heavy cruisers would fall directly onto this city. You wouldn't just die, Grak. Your entire history would be erased by the impact." The warlord's hand moved away from his sword. The silence in the room was heavy. For the first time in his life, Grak understood what it felt like to be a human colony facing a Korg invasion. He felt small. "What do you want?" Grak asked, his voice cracking. "Gold? Territory? We will give you the Outer Rim planets. Just take your monster and leave." Thorne turned around, his expression hard. "We don't want your gold. We have plenty of our own resources. And we don't want your planets. We like our own just fine. What we want is the end of the Korg Empire as a military force. You have spent centuries taking from others. Now, you are going to learn how to give back." Thorne laid a digital pad on the table. "This is the treaty. First, you will dismantle every shipyard you own. Second, you will pay for the reconstruction of every human colony you burned. Third, you will release every slave from every race you have conquered. If you refuse, the Aegis stays here. It won't fire a single shot. It will simply sit in your sky, blocking your sun, until your crops die and your cities go dark. We have enough food on that ship to live for 100 years. You have about 3 weeks." The Korg generals began to shout, but Grak silenced them with a wave of his hand. He looked at the man standing before him. He saw a species that had been pushed to the edge of extinction and had decided to push back. While the leaders argued, the people of the Aegis were watching. On the giant screens in the fortress's public squares, they saw their captain standing tall against the monsters of their childhood. A young girl held her mother's hand. "Is the war over, Mommy?" she asked. The mother looked at the screen, her eyes tearing up. Yes, honey. The war is over. We don't have to be afraid of the dark anymore. This was the true power of the Aegis. It wasn't just the guns or the gravity. It was the peace of mind it gave to 1 billion humans who had spent their lives waiting for the next attack. The fortress was a shield for their souls as much as it was a shield for their bodies. Back in the council chamber, Grak picked up a pen. It was a small, fragile thing in his massive claws. He signed the paper. With that single act, the Korg Empire, the terror of the quadrant, was finished. They were now a protectorate of humanity. Thorn took the pad and nodded. Wise choice, Grak. We will leave a small crew in orbit to oversee the transition. Don't try anything clever. The Aegis has ears in every corner of this palace. As Thorn prepared to teleport back, Grak called out to him. Tell me, human, why didn't you just kill us? You had the power. You could have turned our world to dust. That is what we would have done to you. Thorn paused, the blue light of the teleporter beginning to swirl around him. That's the difference between us, Grak, he said. We didn't build the Aegis to be like you. We built it so we wouldn't have to be like you. We don't want to be the galaxy's nightmare. We just want to be the reason the nightmares stop. With a flash of light, he was gone. The Korg leaders were left in the dark of their own chamber, the shadow of the human fortress still looming over them. The age of conquest was over. The age of humanity had begun, and it was a world where the biggest, scariest thing in the sky was the one keeping everyone safe. As the Aegis of Sol slowly moved away from Korg Prime, it didn't head back to Earth. It headed toward the Alari border. There were other empires that needed to be reminded of the new rules. There were other slaves to be freed, and other bullies to be humbled. The floating fortress was no longer a secret. It was a symbol. To the oppressed, it was a beacon of hope. To the tyrants, it was a giant, metal ghost that could never be outrun. The humans had found their place in the stars, and they had brought a very big chair with them. The galaxy would never be the same again, and for the first time in 1 million years, the stars felt a little bit brighter. The fall of the Korg Empire was a shock that paralyzed the galaxy, but the Alari were not a people to wait for their turn to die. If the Korg were the muscle of the galaxy, the Alari were the brain. They lived on high-tech worlds, where every building was a work of art, and every citizen was connected to a vast, shimmering neural network. They believed that information was the only true weapon. While the Aegis of Sol was busy dismantling the Korg shipyards, the Alari High Council met in secret. They didn't want to fight the fortress with ships. They wanted to kill it from the inside. They decided to use a weapon that humanity had never faced, a digital virus so complex it could rewrite the laws of physics inside a computer core. The Aegis was currently drifting through the sparkling nebula, a beautiful region of space, filled with glowing gas and ancient stars. It was a time of celebration for the humans. For the first time in generations, they weren't looking over their shoulders. Captain Marcus Thorn was in the garden sector, watching children play near a fountain. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known his entire life. But that peace was shattered when the lights flickered. It wasn't a normal power surge. The blue lights of the station turned a sickly, pale green. The hum of the gravity core changed from a deep roar to a high-pitched whine. Thorn tapped his communicator. Sarah, report. What is happening to the power grid? Sarah Vance's voice came back, and for the first time, she sounded terrified. Captain, we are under attack, but there are no ships. Something is inside our network. It's eating the code. The life support systems are starting to cycle off, and the gravity stabilizers are failing. Thorn ran toward the bridge, his boots echoing on the steel floor. Around him, the fortress was waking up to a nightmare. The automated doors were slamming shut, trapping people in hallways. The air was growing thin. The Alari had sent a logic bomb through a hidden back door in the Alari-made communication sensors that humanity had bought decades ago. It was a Trojan horse that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. On the bridge, the screens were a mess of scrolling green symbols. The crew was fighting a losing battle. We can't lock it out, A technician shouted. "It's moving faster than we can. Delete it. It's reached the engine core." The Aegis began to shudder. Outside, the massive engines that held the fortress in place started to fire randomly. The ship began to spin, a slow and deadly rotation that threatened to tear the structure apart. The Alari were watching from a distance, hidden behind a cloaking field. They smiled. They didn't need a big gun. They just needed to turn the human's own home into a spinning tomb. Thorn reached the command chair. "Cut the main computer," he ordered. Sarah looked at him like he was crazy. "Captain, if we do that, we lose everything. We lose the navigation, the shields, even the internal lights. We will be blind in the middle of a nebula." Thorn grabbed the edge of the console as the ship tilted. "If we don't, that virus will trigger a core overload and blow us all to heaven. Do it now. Switch to manual override." It was a gamble. No one had used manual controls on a ship this size in 100 years. It was like trying to steer a mountain with a piece of string. The screens went black. The lights died. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the Aegis of Sol. For a moment, the billions of tons of metal were just drifting, dead in space. But then, a new sound began. It was a low, mechanical grinding. Deep in the heart of the fortress, ancient gears and analog switches built by human engineers who didn't trust fancy Alari. Tech began to click into place. Humanity's love for old technology was about to save them. They had built a secondary control system made of physical wires and vacuum tubes, hidden, away where no digital virus could ever reach. Small, dim emergency lights flickered on. They were red, the color of human blood and human warning. "Manual systems engaged," Sarah whispered, her face lit by the red glow. "We have steering, but it's slow, and we have the guns." Thorn looked at the empty space, where the Alari were hiding. He knew they were there. He could feel their arrogance. "They think we are dead because our computers are off," Thorn said. "They think a human can't fight without a screen to tell them where to aim. Let's show them how we used to do it on Earth." Thorn took a physical joystick, a relic of the past, and gripped it hard. He wasn't using sensors anymore. He was using his eyes and the calculated math written on a piece of paper by a navigator. He pointed the Aegis toward the coordinates where the interference was. "Strongest. Fire the starboard batteries," he ordered. "Blind fire. Fill that sector with lead." The Aegis didn't use smart missiles this time. It used old-fashioned cannons that fired heavy shells. Thousands of rounds poured into the void. Space lit up as the shells hit the invisible Ilari ships. The cloaking fields shattered under the physical impact. 3 golden Ilari cruisers appeared, their sleek hulls dented and broken by the simple iron rain. The Ilari were frozen in shock. Their virus had worked perfectly, yet the human fortress was still fighting. It was like a man who had been poisoned, but refused to fall down. The Aegis moved forward, a dark and silent giant in the red light. The Alari tried to flee, but without their computers to calculate the jump, they were slow. The Aegis didn't even use its big gun. It simply rammed the lead cruiser, its reinforced prow cutting through the Alari ship. Like a knife through paper, the message was clear. "You can break our machines, but you cannot break us." As the human crew began the long process of cleaning the virus from their systems, they realized that the galaxy was even more dangerous than they thought. But they also knew that as long as they had their hands on the wheel, the Aegis would never stop. The failure of the Alari logic bomb sent a wave of terror through the remaining galactic powers. They realized that neither brute force nor clever code could stop the humans. But, while the empires trembled, a new threat was waking up in the deep dark of the Outer Rim. For millions of years, a race known as the Swarm had been sleeping in the void between galaxies. They were not a civilization of cities and laws, but a living wave of hunger. They didn't want to rule the stars. They wanted to consume the life energy of every sun. As the Aegis of Sol sat in the sparkling nebula repairing its systems, the first scouts of the Swarm arrived. They weren't ships made of metal, but giant, biological monsters the size of skyscrapers, with skin like obsidian and eyes that glowed with a cold, blue hunger. On the Aegis, the repairs were going well. The red emergency lights had been replaced by the steady white glow of the main power grid. But the mood was tense. Captain Thorne was in the observation deck, looking out at the nebula. He saw a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. "Sarah, are you seeing this?" he asked over the radio. Sarah Vance, back at her sensor station, was silent for a long moment. "Captain, the long-range sensors are picking up a signature we've never seen. It's organic. And it's huge. It isn't just one ship. It's a wall. It's thousands of kilometers wide, and it's heading straight for the nebula." Thorne realized in an instant that the petty wars with the Korg and the Ilari were nothing compared to this. This was a threat to every living thing. He didn't hesitate. Open a wide beam transmission, all frequencies, all languages. When the screen flickered to life, Thorne didn't just speak to the humans. He spoke to the Korg, the Ilari, and the dozens of smaller races who had spent the last month hiding from him. "This is Captain Thorne of the Aegis of Sol. We have a problem. There is something coming from the void that doesn't care about our treaties or our borders. It is coming to eat everything. I am moving the Aegis to the edge of the nebula to hold the line. If you want your children to see the sun tomorrow, bring your commons, ships, and stand with us." The response was silence. Most of the empires were too afraid to move. But then, a familiar voice broke the static. "The Korg do not hide from a real fight," Warlord Grak growled. "Our shipyards are broken, but we have 500 destroyers left. We are coming, human." Soon after, the Ilari Council followed. "Our logic may have failed against you, Thorne, but our shields are still the best in the galaxy. We will provide the cover, too." For the first time in history, the galaxy was coming together. They weren't doing it out of love for humanity. They were doing it because the Aegis of Sol was the only thing big enough to act as a shield for all of them. The swarm hit the nebula like a tidal wave. The biological monsters moved with a terrifying grace, spitting acid that could melt through titanium and firing beams of concentrated gravity. The Ilari ships formed a shimmering golden wall, but the swarm's numbers were too great. The Korg destroyers charged into the thick of the fight, their cannons roaring, but for every monster they killed, 10 more appeared. The line was breaking. "They're going to get past us," Sarah shouted. "If they reach the inner systems, billions will die." Thorne looked at his crew. They were tired, and their ship was still scarred from the Ilari virus. But he saw the same fire in their eyes that had built this fortress in the first place. Thorne stood up. "All power to the main engine. We aren't going to sit here and shoot." He looked at the map. The swarm was funneling through a narrow gap in the nebula gas. "We are going to plug the hole." The Aegis began to move, its massive engines glowing brighter than they ever had. It was a terrifying sight. A mountain of metal charging into a sea of monsters. The Aegis didn't just fire its guns. It used its entire body as a weapon. It smashed through the leading swarm monsters, their blue blood splashing across the human armor like rain. The fortress was taking massive damage. Sections of the outer hull were being ripped away. But the Aegis didn't stop. In the middle of the swarm, Thorne gave the final order. "Activate the gravity anchor at maximum overload. If we can't kill them all, we'll hold them here until the nebula collapses." It was a suicide mission. The gravity anchor was designed to hold ships, but at overload, it would pull the very gas of the nebula into a single, dense point. The pressure would be enough to crush anything. "Captain, the hull won't hold," Sarah warned. "The pressure will crush us too." Thorne looked at the view of the Korg and Ilari ships retreating to safety. "Then we make sure we're the last thing the swarm ever sees." The Aegis began to glow with an intense, white light. The gravity was so strong that even the swarm monsters couldn't fly away. They were being pulled toward the fortress, their bodies breaking under the weight. On the bridge, the metal floor began to buckle. The crew held onto their stations, looking at each other with a silent goodbye. They had built this ship to save humanity, and now they were using it to save everyone else. But just as the pressure reached the breaking point, a strange thing happened. The Korg and Ilari ships didn't run. They turned back. They attached their own tractor beams to the Aegis, adding their power to the fortress's engines. They weren't letting the humans die alone. Together, they began to push the Aegis and the trapped swarm into the heart of a dying star nearby. It was a moment of pure, impossible unity. The explosion of the star took the swarm with it, a flash of white light that wiped the hunger of the void from the galaxy. When the light faded, the Aegis of Sol was still there. It was broken, its outer plates gone, and its engines cold, but it was still floating. The ships of the Korg and the Alari surrounded it, not as attackers, but as guardians. For the first time in the history, the galaxy was quiet. There was no more talk of empires or colonies. There was only the sound of breathing, the collective sigh of 1,000 different species who had survived. The end of the world. Captain Marcus Thorne stood on the bridge of the Aegis, looking at the cracks in the view screen. He was covered in soot, and his arm was in a sling, but he was alive. The repairs took months, but this time, the humans didn't have to dig for ore in lonely mines. The Korg brought heavy metals from their mountain worlds. The Alari brought advanced crystals for the power cores. Smaller races, who had never been allowed to speak, in the Great Council, brought food, medicine, and art. The Aegis of Sol was no longer just a human fortress. It was being rebuilt as a monument to what happened when people stopped fighting each other and started fighting for each other. The gray metal was now inlaid with golden Ilari patterns and reinforced with dark Korg steel. It was the most beautiful thing ever built in the stars. In the residential sector, the parks were full again, but the children playing there weren't just human. There were young Korg with small, soft scales and Alari children with glowing eyes. They played together in the shadow of the massive cannons that were now silent. The fortress that was once called the galaxy's worst nightmare had become its greatest sanctuary. The schools taught a new kind of history, not a history of wars, but a history of the moment when everyone realized they were on the same side. Sarah Vance, now the chief of engineering for the entire alliance, looked at the blueprints of the new Aegis. "We aren't calling it a fortress anymore, Captain," she said, smiling. "The people are calling it the Beacon." A ceremony was held in the central plaza of the ship. Leaders from every corner of the Grub galaxy stood on the stage. Warlord Grak looked older, his warrior pride replaced by a quiet respect. The Alari elders spoke of a new era of logic, the logic of kindness. When it was Thorne's turn to speak, he didn't give a long speech about human greatness. He looked at the crowd of different faces and simply said, "We built this ship because we were afraid. We thought the only way to be safe was to be the scariest thing in the sky. We were wrong. We are safe because we finally looked at each other and realized that nobody wants to be alone." In the dark, the Aegis of Sol stayed in the sparkling nebula, but it was no longer a secret. It became the capital of the new Galactic Union. It was a place where any species could find a home, a hospital, or a friend. The massive main gun, the weapon that had once terrified the Korg, was dismantled. In its place, they built a giant telescope, looking out into the deep void. They weren't looking for enemies anymore. They were looking for more friends, more life, and more wonders to share. The fortress had served its purpose. It had protected humanity until humanity was strong enough to protect everyone else. Years passed, and the story of the floating fortress became a legend. Travelers would come from thousands of light years away just to see the ship that had saved the stars. They would walk through the steel halls and hear the stories of Captain Thorne and the crew who refused to give up. The humans were no longer the little monkeys or the messy newcomers. They were the bridge builders. They were the ones who had shown the galaxy that a nightmare can be turned into a dream if you have enough courage to hold the line. As the suns of the nebula set behind the massive silhouette of the ship, a young human boy stood at the window, just like the boy from years ago. But he wasn't looking at a battle. He was looking at a fleet of trade ships, science vessels, and explorers leaving the docking bays. He saw the stars and didn't feel small at all. He felt like he belonged. The Aegis of Sol moved slowly through the glowing gas, a giant, peaceful island in a sea of light. The nightmare was gone, and in its place was a future that was bright, loud, and full of hope. Humanity had finally found their home, and they had made enough room for everyone. The galaxy had never heard of a floating fortress quite like this one. It was the worst nightmare for tyrants, but for everyone else, It was the best thing that had ever happened to the stars. And as the Aegis drifted into the horizon of the nebula, the message it sent out was no longer a warning, it was a welcome. This is the Aegis. The way is open. Come on in. Down.